It only takes a single bad data visualization to lose the trust of your audience. A lesson the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation recently learned the hard way. Welcome, friends and foes, to another Data Devotional. This week we're going to continue on with the best, worst examples of data visualizations, this time featuring one of the worst. I'm Luciano Pesci, CEO and founder of Emperitas and Nexum. Like we covered last week, storytelling with data is difficult, and sometimes you're going to fail. We'll cover one of those failures today, which was the recent CBC's controversy on Twitter, now X, surrounding their sources of funding visualization. Like before, we'll present this so that you can learn from their lessons, and we'll end by presenting the data in a less controversial and therefore better form. This example of failure seemed appropriate on the heels of last week's success story around the Fallen.io, because in both cases the problem is storytelling with data. I was quite complimentary of the Fallen.io's creativity in the performance and narrative of their data storytelling. The example that we're going to cover today shows that creativity can go too far. If creativity comes at the cost of clarity, you've made a mistake. Like any other story form, data tales involve specific styles and tropes, and these are limited by what the audience can understand and expect, and this is part of what went wrong with the CBC. As a Crown corporation, the CBC is wholly owned by the Crown, and it was that point that came up during the funding discussion that led to all of the uproar given the visualization that resurfaced. And the CBC quickly learned how critical the public will be of even a single chart. The feud, if you want to call it that, started when the CBC was relabeled as government-funded media. That debate turned into a debate about the proportionality and how that funding could potentially influence content. Throughout the online back and forth on Twitter, this visual emerged. It is from the 2018 to 2019 annual report put out by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It attempts to show the sources of funding. We'll get into why this visual is so bad in a moment, but first let's go through the timeline in greater detail. Because these are the beats of our story. Beats in storytelling, they're a way to tell a story in a predictable format because they follow a flow. And some of that is present here in the back and forth that took place on Twitter. On April 16th, the CBC was labeled government-funded media by Twitter. They responded by pausing activity on Twitter. On April 17th, Elon Musk and the CBC were going back and forth, and very late that evening, Tristan Hopper posted the visual from the annual report to Twitter. And that's really when the firestorm took off. By the 19th, the Alberta report had covered this. Reddit got involved the same day, and by April 20th, there was a viralish video on TikTok that broke down why the chart was so misleading. All of these sources have been aggregated into the link below. It is a secondary resource sheet with links to each of the articles or the Twitter posts mentioned here. The visual at the heart of the dispute didn't just show up in the 2018-19 report, it was also in the 2017-18 report. Prior to that, the same visualization is there, but without one of the issues, the access break. After the 2018-19 report, they switched to a nested donut chart approach, which I think is slightly better, though it can still be a little misleading in one of the two ways that we're about to cover. You can see this report by following the link in the bottom left. The second link there is for all annual reports. The CBC has made this publicly available, which made the data re-engineering that we've done and the EDAing that we'll go over a lot easier. So what specifically is wrong with this visual? To start, you have this access break. If you notice on the y-axis, the increments are going in $100 million, and then $1 billion disappears. That's a problem because it breaks the area principle, which states that the area occupied by a portion of a chart or by a chart should represent the data accurately. What is happening here is an enormous portion of the pink has been abridged. That has changed the area in a fundamental way that tells the opposite story of what's going on. The second issue is that you're looking at nested data, and that's not really clear. And it's nested in the sense that all of this chart is in this purple, and all of this is in that blue. But to someone who's just casually looking at this, these look like distinct categorical things. It's not clear that these are just adding up on themselves. That makes it hard for anyone looking at this chart to not believe that there is additional area representing additional revenue and additional funding, when what we're really looking at is the source of revenue broken out twice into its nested subcategories. In the end, this visual tells the opposite story of reality, which is that the CBC receives the majority of its funding from government directly. I've linked in the bottom left to two different articles explaining the area principle and access breaks. It is common for people to use access breaks. I personally haven't gone back and dug through all the annual reports and looked at the way that this visualization changed over time, I do not believe that this was meant to be intentionally deceitful. This is just sloppy visualization. This is visualization that someone thinks is creative, but that ends up telling the opposite story. And whether that was the intention or not, it opened the CBC up to criticism at a time when the source of their funding was what was being discussed. So let's solve this. Let's correct the mistakes that the CBC made and present the story to scale as it should have been told. You're looking at a live Power BI dashboard. You can find the link for this along with the Google Sheet version in the slide deck. Rather than one chart, we have divided out the sources of funding into the 3 portions. I still don't love this layout. I would not do this. I would put this on 3 different pages. Right now we have one page to retell the story as they were telling it. And what we have done is align as best as possible the axes in these 3 charts closely as possible on the default page, which shows all years. This will change if we start to select individual years. So to look at the 2018 story that was being presented before, we'll click this, and now we're only looking at the 2018 data. We can add 2019 to that, or we can only look at 2019 if we want to. But by default, all years are being showed, and you'll notice that the axes will change as a result of this. So it lines up on the default page. It does not as you start to select the years that you want. The second way that we have improved this visualization, and notice that we have kept the same color coding that was used in the original, is that we have expanded it to include multiple years. This allows us to do some additional exploratory data analysis by looking at each of these by year. So we'll go here to the page. Here's the next page, page 2, the sources of funding by year. You can see a pretty clear pattern. Government funding is the majority, and it has been growing over time until the 2021 period, and we'll get back to that in a moment. Page 3 shows sources of revenue by year, advertising, subscriber fees, and financing and other income. And page 4 will show the digital and television values of advertising as a component of revenue. So remember, this is nested data, so add revenue. All of this is represented in that purple, and all of this is represented in that blue. And this is why they had presented it on one page to show their own stakeholders and decision makers, who were the intended audience from what I can tell of that report. Second to them is then the public. To them, this might make sense. They know that these are nested. To someone who doesn't, it just looks like you're trying to count revenue 3 times. And you're also doing that while shrinking the portion of funding that comes from the government. And all of that leads to a conclusion that you're just not being forthright in your analysis, whether that was the intent or not. Here are the links that I mentioned to the Google Sheet version and the Power BI live link where you can play with this data. Here's a summary of what we've done. We used Power BI to connect via web, which is one of the data connectors, and import the CBC's annual report PDFs, the tables within those PDFs, directly for the years 2018 to 2021. That's why you're able to play with 4 years worth of data. We exported the Power BI tables to Google Sheets. We then used Google Sheets to unify the yearly data into one table. Then we had Power BI pull that unified yearly data from Google Sheets, and we visualized it in both Google Sheets and Power BI. In addition to G Suite and the public-facing version of the report, you can download the PBIX file, that's the Power BI file, and continue the EDA yourself. Here are a few suggestions if you'd like to do that. You could backfill the historical data to build longer trends by pulling in more of the annual report PDF data. You could also analyze the growth of CBC's advertising revenue. The 20 to 21 jump is notable because there has been private sector pushback on this. It is another hot button issue related to the sources of funding for the CBC. Those are just a few of the ways that you can keep your own data progress going and correct the mistakes that others make along the way when trying to storytell with data. And I'll see you at the next devotional.